They said I was lazy, that I moved through the house like a ghost too tired to haunt properly. But ghosts do not rise before dawn to light the fires, and ghosts do not scrub the marble floors until their knees bruise purple beneath their skirts. My name is Florence Webb, and for 11 years I served as a maid in Ashworth Hall, the grandest estate in all of Hertfordshire. I came to that house when I was 19, orphaned and alone, with nothing but a letter of recommendation from the vicar's wife, and a heart still foolish enough to believe that hard work would someday be rewarded. My mother had died of fever when I was 17, and my father followed her into the grave not 6 months later, his heart too broken to continue beating without her. I had no siblings, no relations willing to take me in, no prospects of marriage or trade. The vicar's wife wrote the letter that would determine the course of my life. She described me as diligent, honest, and God-fearing. She did not mention that I was terrified. I did not know then that some houses swallow you whole, that some silences are louder than any scream, and that the cruelest people often wear the finest lace. Ashworth Hall stood at the edge of the village like a stone cathedral, its windows glinting in the morning light like the eyes of something watchful. 300 rooms, they said, though I never counted them all. The estate had been in the Ashworth family for 7 generations, passed from duke to duke like a crown, accumulating history and secrets with each passing decade. The grounds stretched for miles in every direction, encompassing formal gardens, ancient woodlands, a lake that froze silver in winter, and tenant farms whose inhabitants touched their caps whenever the carriage passed. It was a kingdom unto itself, and at its center sat the great house, magnificent and cold. I knew only the servants' corridors, the back staircases worn smooth by generations of feet like mine, the cold stone passages where the sunlight never reached. That was my world. The servants' quarters occupied the uppermost floor, a warren of small rooms with sloped ceilings and narrow beds. My own room was scarcely larger than a closet, furnished with a bed, a washstand, and a single hook for my spare dress. The window looked out over the kitchen gardens, and in summer I could smell the herbs when the breeze blew right. It was not much, but it was mine, the only space in that vast house where I could close a door and breathe. The front of the house, with its gilded mirrors and velvet curtains and chandeliers that sparkled like frozen rain, belonged to them, to the Duke and his Duchess, to the life I was meant to serve but never touch. I moved through those grand rooms like water, cleaning around the edges of their existence, erasing the evidence of my own presence even as I worked. A good servant, Mrs. Hartley told me on my first day, is invisible. You are the hand that straightens the cushion, the cloth that polishes the silver. You are never the one who is seen. I learned that lesson well, perhaps too well. The Duke, Theodore Ashworth, was not a young man when I arrived. He was perhaps 50 then, with silver threading through his dark hair and a quietness about him that the other servants mistook for coldness. They whispered that he was stern, that he cared for nothing but his books and his solitude. They said he had been different once, before his first wife died, before grief had hollowed him out and left only this shell of a man who walked through his own house like a stranger. But I saw him differently. I saw the way he paused at windows, looking out at the gardens with something like longing in his eyes. I saw how he lingered in the library long after midnight, a single candle burning beside him, his fingers tracing the spines of books as though they were old friends. I saw him feed scraps to the kitchen cat when he thought no one was watching, his stern face softening into something almost tender. He was not cold. He was simply alone in a house full of people, and I understood that kind of loneliness better than anyone. His wife, Lavinia, was another matter entirely. She had come to Ashworth Hall 5 years before my arrival, a bride of 23 with golden hair and ambitions to match. The Duke had been a widower for nearly a decade by then, and society had whispered that he would never remarry. But Lavinia was not the sort of woman who accepted defeat. She was the daughter of a baron, beautiful and clever, with a talent for making herself indispensable to those who could advance her position. She had set her sights on the Duke of Ashworth, and she had won him through sheer persistence, until at last he had proposed, perhaps simply to end the siege. I remember the first time I saw her. She swept into the entrance hall in a gown of deep burgundy silk, her golden hair piled high and studded with pearls, her pale blue eyes surveying everything and everyone as though calculating their worth. She was beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful, all sharp edges and glittering frost. The servants straightened their spines when she passed. The footmen held their breath. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Hartley, a woman who had weathered 30 years of service with an iron will, seemed to shrink slightly in the Duchess's presence. Lavinia had married the Duke for his title and his fortune. This was not speculation on my part. She said it herself, openly, to her friends who visited for tea, laughing as though it were the cleverest joke in the world. I heard her once, as I polished the silver in the adjoining room, her voice carrying through the half-open door. "Love," she had said, "is for shopkeepers and poets. I married position. Theodore gives me his name and his fortune, and in return I grace his table and manage his household. It is a fair exchange, is it not?" Her friends had laughed, and I had stood frozen with the silver cloth in my hand, wondering how anyone could speak of marriage with such cold calculation. I do not know if the Duke ever loved her. Perhaps he did once. But by the time I knew them, whatever tenderness might have existed between them had withered into silence. They dined at opposite ends of a table meant for 40, the candelabras between them like soldiers standing guard. They passed each other in hallways without a word. At night, they retired to separate chambers on separate floors, and the vast house settled around them like a held breath. It was Lavinia who first called me lazy. I remember the day with perfect clarity. It was winter, the year after I arrived, and the cold had seeped into every corner of the house. I had been scrubbing the floor of the main gallery, a task that took hours because the marble was veined with black and showed every speck of dust. The gallery was the pride of Ashworth Hall, a long corridor lined with portraits of Ashworth ancestors. The floor had to be perfect, Mrs. Hartley said. The Duchess noticed everything. My arms ached, my back screamed. My knees had gone numb against the cold stone, and I could no longer feel my fingers where they gripped the brush. The winter light through the tall windows was thin and gray, offering no warmth. I had been at it since 6 in the morning, and the clock had just chimed 11. I paused for just a moment, just a single moment, to press my hand against the small of my back and ease the pain there. And that was when she appeared. I did not hear her coming. Lavinia moved like smoke when she wished to, silent and insinuating. One moment I was alone with my brush and my bucket, and the next she was standing over me, her shadow falling across the wet floor like a stain. She wore a morning gown of pale blue, her hair perfectly arranged, her face serene and terrible. "What do you think you are doing?" she asked. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. There was something in its coolness that cut deeper than any shout. I scrambled to my feet, my wet hands leaving prints on my apron. I nearly slipped on the damp marble in my haste. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," I said. "I was only resting for a moment. The floor is nearly finished." She looked at me then, truly looked at me, and I felt myself shrinking beneath her gaze. Her eyes moved over my face, my hair escaping from its pins, my reddened hands, my worn dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. I saw myself as she must have seen me, small, insignificant, a creature barely worth noticing. "Lazy," she said, and the word fell between us like a stone into still water. "That is what you are. Lazy and slow and utterly without purpose. I have been watching you from the window, and in the past quarter hour you have done nothing but dawdle. I wonder that Mrs. Hartley keeps you on at all." I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell her that I had been working since 4 in the morning, that I had lit the fires in 12 rooms, that I had carried water up 3 flights of stairs and polished the brass until my fingers cracked and bled. I wanted to show her my hands, my knees, the bruises that mapped my body like a record of devotion. But the words died in my throat. Servants did not argue with duchesses. Servants simply bowed their heads and accepted whatever judgment fell upon them. "Yes, Your Grace," I whispered. "I am sorry, Your Grace." She smiled then, a small, satisfied curve of her lips, and swept away without another word. Her perfume lingered in the air after she had gone, something French and expensive. I stood there for a long time, my hands trembling, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. The marble floor gleamed beneath me, perfect and cold, unmarked by any evidence of my labor. That was the first time. It was not the last. Over the years, Lavinia found countless opportunities to remind me of my laziness. She did it in front of the other servants, her voice carrying across kitchens and corridors. She did it in front of her guests, pausing mid-conversation to point out some imagined failing in my work. She did it with smiles and with sighs and with the particular cruelty of someone who knows their power is absolute. The other servants learned to echo her. Not all of them, but enough. The younger maids giggled when I passed. The footmen smirked. Even Mrs. Hartley began to look at me with something like disappointment, as though she too had come to believe that I was less than I should be. Lavinia had poisoned the well, and now everyone drank from it. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that words were only words, that they could not touch the truth of who I was. But words have weight. They accumulate like snow upon a roof until one day the whole structure groans and threatens to collapse. I began to move more slowly, to hesitate before every task, afraid that any action I took would somehow prove her right. I stopped speaking unless spoken to. I stopped meeting anyone's eyes. I was disappearing, inch by inch, into the very laziness she had invented for me. And then, one autumn evening, everything changed. I was in the library dusting the shelves as I did every Thursday. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. The room smelled of old paper and wood smoke, a scent that had always comforted me, that reminded me of the small collection of books my father had kept. I had thought myself alone. The Duke rarely used the library in the evenings anymore, preferring instead the smaller study near his chambers. But that night, he was there. I did not see him at first. He sat in the tall wingback chair near the window, so still that he seemed part of the furniture itself, another shadow among shadows. It was only when I reached for a book on a high shelf and heard a soft sound behind me that I turned and found him watching me. I nearly dropped my cloth in surprise. "Your Grace," I gasped, pressing my hand to my heart. "Forgive me. I did not know you were here. I will leave at once." He raised his hand, a small gesture that stopped me mid-curtsy. "No," he said. "Stay. You are not disturbing me. Indeed, you are the first tolerable company I have had in quite some time." His voice was different than I had expected. There was a gentleness in it, an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the soul. I hesitated, uncertain. It was not proper for a maid to remain alone in a room with the master of the house. But he had asked me to stay, and one did not refuse a duke. I returned to my dusting, though my hands trembled slightly. I could feel his gaze upon me, steady and thoughtful, and I did not know what to make of it. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the soft whisper of my cloth against the leather bindings and the occasional pop of the dying fire. And then he spoke again. "They call you lazy," he said. It was not a question. I froze, my hand suspended in midair. "Yes, Your Grace," I managed. "The Duchess has said so." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer still, almost as though he were speaking to himself rather than to me. "I have watched you, Florence Webb," he said. "I have watched you rise before the dawn and work until your hands bleed. I have seen you carry burdens twice your weight upstairs that would wind a man half your age. I have observed you in the corners of this house, in the shadows where no one else thinks to look, and I have seen the truth of you. I could not breathe. No one had ever spoken to me this way. No one had ever seen me at all. You are not lazy, he continued, and his voice grew firmer now. You are the farthest thing from it. What you are is invisible to those who do not wish to see, and that, I think, is a far crueler fate than any they could name. I felt the tears then, hot and sudden, spilling down my cheeks before I could stop them. I turned away, ashamed, but he made no move to dismiss me. I am sorry, he said quietly. I should have spoken sooner. I should have done many things sooner. But I was tired, and I let my silence become a kind of cruelty too. I did not know what he meant. I did not ask. I simply stood there in the firelight, crying silently, while the Duke of Ashworth sat in his chair and bore witness to a grief that had been building for years. That night changed something between us, not in any way that the world would have recognized or approved. We did not speak often after that. We did not need to. But when our paths crossed in the corridors, he would offer me a small nod, the barest acknowledgement that I existed. And when Lavinia's cruelty found me, as it always did, I would remember his words and wrap them around myself like armor. You are not lazy. You are invisible to those who do not wish to see. I held on to those words through the long winter that followed, through the spring that bloomed and faded, through the summer that burned and cooled. I held on to them as the Duke grew weaker, as the doctors came and went with grave faces and hushed voices, as the house began to fill with the particular silence that precedes grief. And I held on to them on the October morning when Mrs. Hartley found me in the kitchen and told me, her voice cracking, that His Grace had passed in the night. The Duke was dead, and nothing, I thought, would ever be the same again. I was wrong, of course, but not in the way I expected. The true change was still coming, waiting for me in a solicitor's office, in a document sealed with wax, in words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my place in this world. The reading of the will was scheduled for 3 days hence. I had no reason to attend. I had no reason to expect that my name would be spoken at all. But fate, it seems, had other plans. The days between the Duke's death and the reading of his will passed in a strange twilight, as though the house itself had fallen into mourning. The clocks still chimed the hours, the fires still burned in their grates, but everything felt muffled, wrapped in the kind of silence that follows a great storm. I continued my work, as I always had. There was comfort in routine, in the familiar weight of the coal bucket, in the rhythm of the brush against the floor. The other servants moved through their duties with red-rimmed eyes and hushed voices, speaking of the Duke in tones reserved for saints and heroes. How kind he had been, they said now. How generous. How unlike other masters they had served. It seemed that death had finally made them see what they had been too busy to notice while he lived. Lavinia, for her part, played the grieving widow with the skill of an actress born to the stage. She wore black silk that rustled when she walked, and she dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief whenever visitors called to offer their condolences. But I saw her when she thought no one was watching. I saw the way her lips curved into something that was not quite a smile as she walked through the house, touching the furniture, the paintings, the silver candlesticks, as though taking inventory of what was now hers. She did not grieve, she calculated. On the morning of the 3rd day, Mrs. Hartley summoned me to her sitting room. I went with a flutter of unease in my chest, wondering what I had done wrong, what new accusation Lavinia had leveled against me. But when I entered, I found the housekeeper sitting at her desk with an expression I had never seen before. She looked almost frightened. "Florence," she said, and her voice was strange, uncertain. "You have been summoned to the reading of the will." I stared at her. Certain I had misheard. "The reading of the will," I repeated, "but that is for family, for the Duchess and the solicitors." Mrs. Hartley shook her head slowly. The solicitor's letter was quite specific. You are to attend." She paused, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I do not understand it any more than you do, but the Duke's wishes were clear." I walked to the drawing room in a daze, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. The great house seemed larger than ever, the corridors stretching endlessly before me, the portraits on the walls watching my passage with painted eyes that seemed to hold some secret they would not share. I smoothed my dress, my best dress, though it was still plain and worn compared to anything Lavinia owned. I had no place in that room. I had no place anywhere except in the shadows. When I entered, Lavinia was already seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her black dress pooling around her like spilled ink. She looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and her pale eyes narrowed with something between confusion and contempt. "What is she doing here?" she demanded, addressing the solicitor as though I were not present, as though I were a piece of furniture that had been moved without her permission. The solicitor, a thin man with spectacles and a leather case, rose from his seat and inclined his head. "Mrs. Webb was specifically named in His Grace's instructions, Your Grace. She is required to be present for the reading." Lavinia's mouth tightened, but she said nothing more. She waved her hand in a gesture of dismissal, and I understood that I was to remain standing near the door as befitted my station. I clasped my hands before me and tried to make myself small, invisible, as I had learned to do over so many years. There were others in the room as well. The Duke's younger brother, Lord Reginald Ashworth, sat in a corner with his wife, a timid woman who seemed perpetually on the verge of tears. Two distant cousins had traveled from the north, their faces sharp with poorly concealed greed. And there was Mr. Clarence Thornton, the estate's steward, a man I had seen only in passing, who managed the farms and the tenants and the countless details of running such a vast property. They all glanced at me when I entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disdain, before returning their attention to the solicitor. The reading began. I understood little of the legal language, the whereases and heretofores that seemed designed to obscure rather than illuminate. I learned that the Duke had been a methodical man, that he had updated his will several times over the years, that the version being read was dated just 3 months before his death. The solicitor spoke of trusts and provisions, of annuities for loyal servants, of charitable bequests to the village church and the local hospital. Lord Reginald was to receive a modest sum and the use of the London townhouse. The cousins were given heirlooms, paintings, pieces of jewelry that had belonged to the Ashworth family for generations. Mr. Thornton was praised for his service and granted a pension that would see him through his remaining years in comfort. And then the solicitor paused. The room grew very still. I felt something shift in the air, a tension that had not been there before. Lavinia leaned forward slightly in her chair, her eyes bright with anticipation. "To my wife, Lavinia Ashworth," the solicitor read, his voice steady and deliberate, "I leave the sum of £1 sterling." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one breathed. I saw Lavinia's face go pale, then red, then pale again, cycling through emotions too quickly to name. Her hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "That is impossible," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "There must be some mistake." The solicitor did not look up from his papers. "There is no mistake, Your Grace. The document is quite clear." £1, Lavinia repeated. £1. After everything I gave him, everything I sacrificed, he leaves me £1. I watched her face contort with rage, with disbelief, with the dawning horror of understanding. She had expected everything. She had expected the house, the land, the fortune accumulated over 7 generations. She had expected to live as she had always lived, surrounded by luxury, commanding servants, hosting balls and dinners that would make all of society whisper her name with envy. And instead, she had been given less than a kitchen maid earned in a month. The solicitor cleared his throat and continued. The remainder of the estate, he said, including Ashworth Hall, all lands and properties thereto attached, all investments, accounts, and holdings, both domestic and foreign, valued in total at approximately £10 million, is to be left in its entirety to Miss Florence Webb. The world stopped. I heard the words, but they did not make sense. They could not make sense. I was a maid. I was nobody. I had nothing, owned nothing, expected nothing. My name did not belong in the same sentence as £10 million. My name did not belong in a will at all. Someone was speaking. Several people were speaking. I heard Lavinia's voice rising in fury, heard Lord Reginald's startled exclamation, heard the rustle of papers and the scrape of chairs against the floor. But it all seemed to come from very far away, as though I were underwater, as though a great distance had opened between me and the rest of the world. The solicitor was looking at me. His expression was kind, though there was something else in it too, something that might have been pity or might have been respect. "Miss Webb," he said. "Miss Webb, do you understand what has been read?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I shook my head, a small, helpless gesture. "You are the sole heir to the Ashworth estate," he said gently. "The Duke left you everything." "This is outrageous!" Lavinia cried, rising from her chair with such violence that it toppled backward and crashed against the floor. "This is fraud! This is madness!" She turned to me, and her eyes were terrible, burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to set the very air on fire. "What did you do to him?" she demanded. "What arts did you use? What lies did you tell? To make him give you what is rightfully mine?" "I did nothing," I whispered. "I knew nothing of this." "Liar!" she spat. "You scheming, conniving little serpent. You wormed your way into his confidence with your quiet ways and your humble airs, and now you think you can steal everything I have worked for. I will not allow it. I will contest this will in every court in England. I will see you ruined, destroyed, thrown into the streets where you belong." Lord Reginald rose from his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Lavinia, please," he said. "This is neither the time nor the place." She whirled on him. "Do not tell me what is appropriate," she hissed. "Your brother has made a mockery of this family, of our name, of everything we represent. And you stand there like a fool and tell me to be calm." The solicitor intervened, his voice firm despite the chaos. "The will is legally sound, Your Grace. It was witnessed by 2 men of impeccable reputation, and His Grace was examined by his physician the very day he signed it, who attested to his sound mind and judgment. You are, of course, entitled to seek legal counsel, but I must warn you that any challenge is unlikely to succeed." Lavinia stared at him for a long moment, her chest heaving, her hands trembling at her sides. Then she turned and walked toward me, stopping so close that I could smell her perfume, could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that powder could not quite conceal. "You," she said, and her voice was low now, controlled, all the more frightening for its calmness. "You think you have won. You think you can take my house, my position, my life. But you are nothing. You will always be nothing. And I will make certain that everyone knows it." She swept past me and out of the room, her black skirts trailing behind her like the wake of a ship. The door slammed with such force that the paintings on the walls trembled. In the silence that followed, I stood perfectly still, unable to move, unable to think. The others were staring at me with expressions that ranged from shock to calculation to something that might have been respect. Lord Reginald cleared his throat and muttered something about needing air. The cousins exchanged glances and began to whisper. Mr. Thornton, the steward, rose from his seat and approached me with careful steps. "Miss Webb," he said quietly, "perhaps you would like to sit down." I looked at him, and something in his steady gaze, his plain, honest face, broke through the numbness that had settled over me. "Yes," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, thin and distant. "Yes, I think I would." He guided me to a chair, the very chair where Lavinia had sat, and I sank into it gratefully. My legs were shaking, my hands would not stop trembling. I looked around the room, at the high ceilings and the velvet drapes and the crystal chandelier that caught the light and scattered it like diamonds across the walls. This was mine now, all of it. The house where I had scrubbed floors and carried coal and been called lazy by a woman who had never worked a day in her life. The estate that stretched for miles in every direction. The fortune that would have seemed like a fairy tale if anyone had told me of it only yesterday, and I had no idea what to do with any of it. The solicitor approached and handed me an envelope. "This was left for you specifically," he said. "The Duke instructed that it be given to you after the reading, and only to you." I took the envelope with hands that would not steady. It was heavy cream paper, sealed with the Ashworth crest in deep red wax. My name was written on the front in handwriting I recognized, the same handwriting I had seen on notes left for the butler, on letters that passed through the house on their way to distant correspondence. The Duke's handwriting. "Would you like privacy?" the solicitor asked. I nodded, unable to speak. The room emptied slowly. Lord Reginald and his wife departed with murmured words I did not hear. The cousins lingered, clearly hoping for some explanation, some reversal, but eventually they too took their leave. "Mr." Thornton paused at the door. "If you need anything," he said, "I am at your service. I served His Grace faithfully for 20 years, and I will serve you with the same loyalty if you will have me." "Thank you," I managed. And then I was alone. I sat in the silent room, holding the envelope in my lap, unable to bring myself to open it. Outside the windows, the autumn light was fading toward evening, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The fire had burned low in the grate, and the room was growing cold, but I did not move to stoke it. I simply sat and breathed and tried to make sense of a world that had been turned completely upside down. Finally, with fingers that trembled only slightly, I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in the Duke's careful hand. I unfolded it slowly, reverently, as though it were a sacred text, and I began to read. "My dear Florence," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have learned what I could never bring myself to tell you while I lived." I paused, blinking back tears that blurred the words. "You are wondering why," the letter continued, "why I have done this impossible thing. Why I have given everything I possess to a woman who, in the eyes of the world, is nothing but a servant. Let me tell you. In all my years I have known many people. I have dined with princes and parliaments, with poets and philosophers. I have been surrounded by wealth and privilege and power since the day I was born. And yet, in all that time, I have met precious few souls who possess true worth. You, Florence, are one of them. I watched you suffer in silence. I watched my wife wound you with words, day after day, year after year, and I did nothing to stop it. That is my shame, and I will carry it to my grave. But I also watched you endure. I watched you rise before dawn and work without complaint. I watched you treat the lowest kitchen boy with the same respect you showed the highest guest. I watched you hold onto your dignity when everything around you conspired to strip it away. That is worth more than any title. That is worth more than any fortune. I leave you Ashworth Hall not as a gift, but as a recognition of what you already are. The others saw a lazy maid. I saw a woman of extraordinary strength and grace. I pray that the world will now see you as I did. Use this fortune well. Do not let it change the woman you have become. And if my wife makes your life difficult, as I know she will, remember this: she cannot touch what you carry inside. She never could. With respect and admiration, Theodore Ashworth. I folded the letter carefully and pressed it to my heart. The tears fell freely now, streaming down my cheeks, dripping onto the fine fabric of the chair. I wept for the Duke, for the kindness he had shown me when no one else would. I wept for myself, for the girl who had arrived at this house with nothing and was now its mistress. And I wept for the uncertain future that stretched before me. Vast and terrifying and full of possibilities I could not yet imagine. When at last the tears subsided, I rose from the chair and walked to the window. The sun had set, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the house, I could hear doors opening and closing, voices raised in argument or amazement. The news would be spreading now, racing through the servants' quarters like fire through dry grass. By tomorrow, all of Hertfordshire would know. By the end of the week, all of England. The lazy maid had inherited everything, and Lavinia would never forgive me for it. The scandal spread through society like wildfire through dry brush. Within a week, there was not a drawing room in England that did not whisper my name. Not a newspaper that did not speculate about the mysterious maid who had somehow bewitched a dying duke into leaving her his entire fortune. I learned quickly that wealth does not purchase peace. If anything, it invites war. The newspapers were merciless. They printed illustrations of me that bore no resemblance to my actual face, depicting me as either a scheming temptress with hooded eyes and crimson lips, or a simpering fool who had stumbled into fortune through sheer luck. The headlines grew more sensational by the day. "The servant's revenge," one proclaimed. Another asked, "Did the Duke lose his mind or his heart?" The penny papers were worse still, spinning tales of seduction and treachery that would have been laughable if they had not been so damaging. I stopped reading them after the first week. Mrs. Hartley, bless her loyal heart, took to intercepting the newspapers before they reached me, burning them in the kitchen fire before I could see the latest accusations. But I knew they were there. I could see it in the way visitors looked at me, in the whispers that followed me whenever I ventured beyond the estate's gates, in the letters that arrived daily, some congratulating me on my good fortune, others condemning me as a thief, a harlot, a disgrace to decent women everywhere. Lavinia refused to leave Ashworth Hall. She had no legal right to remain, as the solicitor had made abundantly clear, but she simply ignored all requests that she vacate the premises. She installed herself in the East Wing like a queen in exile, continuing to act as though she were still the mistress of the house. She issued orders to servants who no longer knew whom to obey. She received visitors who came to gawk and gossip rather than offer genuine sympathy. And she conducted herself with the imperious dignity of a woman who had been grievously wronged. The servants were caught in the middle of our silent war. Some remained loyal to Lavinia, either out of long habit or genuine affection or simple fear of what she might do to them if they defected. Others tentatively transferred their allegiance to me, bringing me morning tea and asking hesitantly if there was anything I required. A few simply fled, unable to bear the tension that crackled through the house like lightning before a storm. When I passed Lavinia in the corridors, she looked through me as though I were made of glass, as though I did not exist at all. She never spoke to me directly. She communicated through the servants, through pointed silences, through doors slammed just loudly enough to be heard throughout the wing. It was a war of attrition, and I did not know how long I could endure it. I found myself trapped in a strange purgatory. I was the legal owner of everything I surveyed, yet I felt more like an intruder than ever before. The grand rooms that had once been forbidden to me now stood empty and waiting, but I could not bring myself to occupy them. I continued to take my meals in the kitchen with the servants who would still have me. I continued to wear my plain dresses, unable to imagine myself in silk and jewels. I continued to wake before dawn, my body so accustomed to the rhythm of labor that it did not know how to rest. Mrs. Hartley came to see me on the third morning after the reading. I was in the library, sitting in the very chair where the Duke had once sat, trying to make sense of the documents Mr. Thornton had given me regarding the estate's finances. The numbers swam before my eyes, incomprehensible as a foreign language. When she knocked on the door and entered, I saw that she had been crying. "Miss Webb," she began, and then stopped, shaking her head. Forgive me. I do not know what to call you now. Florence, I said gently. You may still call me Florence. That has not changed. She smiled, but it was a fragile thing, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. I came to apologize, she said, her voice thick with emotion. For all the times I believed her grace when she called you lazy. For all the times I looked at you with disappointment when I should have looked more closely and seen the truth. You worked harder than anyone in this house, and I let myself be fooled by a woman who never lifted a finger except to point it in accusation. The words struck me more deeply than I expected. Mrs. Hartley had been the closest thing to a mother I had known since my own mother died. Her disapproval had wounded me in ways I had never fully acknowledged, had made me doubt myself when I should have stood firm. It is forgiven, I said, and I meant it. We were all under her spell. She has a talent for making people see what she wants them to see. Mrs. Hartley nodded, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. What will you do now? She asked. About the Duchess, I mean. She cannot stay here forever. I do not know, I admitted. I have no wish to throw her into the street, despite everything she has done to me. But I cannot live in the same house with her hatred forever. It is like sharing a roof with a storm that never breaks. The answer to that question came sooner than I expected, and from a direction I had not anticipated. That afternoon, a carriage arrived at the front entrance. I watched from the window of the library as a man stepped out, tall and well-dressed, with dark hair and a bearing that spoke of authority and education. He was perhaps 35, with strong features and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, missing nothing, cataloging every detail for future reference. Something about him felt familiar, though I was certain I had never seen him before. Perhaps it was simply that he carried himself like a man who knew his own worth, a quality I had rarely encountered in my years of service. Mr. Thornton appeared at my door, his expression troubled. "There is a gentleman here to see you," he said, "a Mr. Edmund Blackwood. He says he is a barrister, and that he has been retained to represent the Duchess in her challenge to the will." My heart sank. "So it begins," I murmured. "Shall I tell him you are not receiving visitors?" Mr. Thornton asked, and I could hear the protective note in his voice. He had become something of an ally in those strange first days, treating me with the same quiet respect he had shown the Duke. "No," I said, rising from my chair. "I will see him. I have nothing to hide, and avoiding him will only make me look guilty." I received Mr. Blackwood in the drawing room, the same room where the will had been read. It seemed fitting somehow, as though the battle lines were being drawn on the very ground where victory had first been declared. He entered with confidence, his eyes sweeping the room with the practiced assessment of a man who evaluated everything and everyone he encountered. When his gaze settled on me, I felt something shift in the air, though I could not have said what it was. "Miss Webb," he said, and his voice was deep and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in courtrooms and commanding attention. "I appreciate your willingness to see me. Many in your position would have refused." "I saw no reason to refuse," I replied, gesturing for him to sit. "I have nothing to hide. If you have questions, I will answer them honestly." He took the seat across from me, crossing one leg over the other with casual elegance. His suit was finely tailored, his cravat tied with precision, everything about him speaking of a man who understood the importance of appearances. "You may be wondering why I requested this meeting," he said. "My client, the Duchess, has retained me to examine the possibility of contesting the late Duke's will. It is my duty to investigate all avenues that might support her claim." "I understand," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the flutter of anxiety in my chest. "And what avenues do you believe exist?" He was silent for a moment, studying me with those penetrating eyes. I had the uncomfortable sensation of being read like a document, every line and expression analyzed for meaning. "There are several grounds on which a will may be contested," he said carefully. Undue influence is the most common. The suggestion that the testator was manipulated or coerced into making decisions that did not reflect his true wishes. There is also the question of testamentary capacity, whether the Duke was of sound mind when he signed the document. And of course, there are more serious allegations: fraud, forgery, deception. "And do you believe any of these apply to my situation?" I asked. Something flickered in his expression, something that might have been surprise or admiration. "I believe in examining the evidence before forming conclusions," he said. "That is why I am here, to see for myself the woman who has caused such upheaval in one of England's oldest families." I felt my cheeks flush with something between anger and embarrassment. "I did not cause any upheaval, Mr. Blackwood. I did not ask for this inheritance. I did not scheme or manipulate or deceive. I was as surprised as anyone when the will was read. More surprised, perhaps, because unlike the others, I had no expectations. I had no right to expect anything at all." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Then tell me, Miss Webb, if you did nothing to earn such generosity, why do you suppose the Duke chose to leave you everything?" I thought of the letter, still folded carefully in the drawer of my bedside table. I thought of the Duke's words, of his apology for remaining silent while Lavinia tormented me, of his recognition of worth that no one else had bothered to see. I thought of that evening in the library when he had spoken to me as though I were a person rather than a piece of furniture. "Because he saw me," I said quietly. "When everyone else looked through me as though I were invisible, he saw me. He saw me work without complaint. He saw me endure cruelty without losing my dignity. He saw me, Mr. Blackwood. And perhaps that meant more to him than all the scheming and flattery in the world." Mr. Blackwood said nothing for a long moment. His gaze remained fixed on my face, searching for something I could not name. Then he rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where the autumn leaves were beginning to fall, covering the ground in shades of gold and rust and dying red. "I have represented many clients in my career," he said, his back still turned to me. "I have seen fortunes won and lost, families torn apart, reputations destroyed over matters of inheritance. I have learned to recognize deception in all its forms. The careful liar who rehearses every word, the reckless liar who trusts in charm, the desperate liar who believes their own falsehoods." He turned to face me, and there was something different in his expression now, something softer. "And I have learned to recognize truth." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I am saying, Miss Webb, that I came here expecting to find a schemer, a manipulator, a woman who had somehow tricked a dying man into betraying his own family. Instead, I find a woman who speaks plainly, who does not flinch from difficult questions, who seems genuinely bewildered by the fortune that has fallen into her lap." He paused, and something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Either you are the most accomplished liar I have ever encountered, or you are exactly what you appear to be. And which do you believe?" He smiled fully now, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, almost boyish despite the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair. "I believe," he said slowly, "that this case is far more complicated than my client led me to expect." In the days that followed, Mr. Blackwood became a frequent visitor to Ashworth Hall. He claimed it was necessary for his investigation, that he needed to examine documents and interview servants and review the circumstances of the Duke's final months. But I began to suspect that his visits had another purpose as well. He sought me out whenever he came. We would walk in the gardens despite the November chill, discussing everything from the law to literature to the philosophy of justice. He told me about his career, about the cases that had made his reputation, about his belief that the law should serve truth rather than merely those who could afford to pay for it. He spoke of his own family, modest in origin, and how he had worked his way through the inns of court on scholarship and determination. I found myself looking forward to his visits, counting the days between them, listening for the sound of his carriage on the gravel drive. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that he was Lavinia's barrister, that his loyalty lay with her, that any kindness he showed me was simply a strategy to extract information. But there were moments when he looked at me, and I forgot all of that. Moments when his hand brushed mine as he handed me a book, and the touch sent a shock through my entire body. Moments when I caught him watching me with an expression that had nothing to do with legal strategy and everything to do with something far more dangerous. Lavinia noticed, of course. She noticed everything that happened within her domain, even a domain that was no longer legally hers. She cornered me one evening in the upstairs corridor, her face twisted with fury. "I see what you are doing," she hissed. "First my husband, and now my barrister. Is there no man you will not seduce to get what you want?" "I have done nothing improper," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "Mr. Blackwood is conducting his investigation, nothing more." "Do not lie to me," she spat. "I see the way he looks at you. I see the way you look at him. You think you can steal everything from me and face no consequences. But I promise you, Florence Webb, I will destroy you before I let that happen. I will see you ruined, penniless, begging in the streets, and I will enjoy every moment of it." She swept past me and disappeared into the darkness of the corridor. I stood there for a long time, trembling, wondering how much longer I could endure living under the same roof as her hatred. The answer came the following week. Mr. Blackwood arrived at the house on a gray November morning, his expression grave. He asked to speak with me privately, and when we were alone in the library, he withdrew a document from his case and placed it on the desk between us. "I have completed my investigation," he said, "and I have reached a conclusion." I braced myself for the worst. "What conclusion?" I asked. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I had not seen before. Something that looked almost like relief, and beneath it, something warmer still. "There are no grounds to contest the will," he said. "The Duke was of sound mind when he signed it. His physician has attested to that in writing. There is no evidence of undue influence, no suggestion of fraud. The bequest to you, however unusual, is legally unassailable." I stared at him, hardly daring to believe it. "Then it is over?" "The legal challenge is over," he said. "But I must warn you, when I inform my client that she has no case, she will not accept it gracefully. Lavinia Ashworth is not a woman who accepts defeat. If she cannot take your fortune through the courts, she will try to take something else." "What would you have me do?" I asked. He reached across the desk and took my hand. "Let me help you," he said. "Not as her barrister. I will resign that position today, but as someone who has come to care for you, someone who cannot bear to see you harmed." My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he could hear it. "Edmund," I whispered, "this is not proper." "Nothing about this situation is proper," he said. "Perhaps it is time we stopped pretending otherwise." Outside the window, the November rain began to fall, and in that moment, despite everything, I allowed myself to hope. Edmund resigned his position as Lavinia's barrister that very afternoon. I learned later that she had thrown a porcelain vase at his head when he delivered the news, a priceless piece from the Ming dynasty that shattered against the wall mere inches from his face, spraying fragments across the Turkish carpet like deadly snowflakes. He had left her chambers with shards of china in his hair, and her screams echoing through the east wing. Curses so vile that even the footmen had blushed to hear them through the heavy oak doors. Edmund told me this with a wry smile, as though it were a minor inconvenience rather than a violent attack, but I saw something darker beneath his calm exterior. He knew, as I did, that Lavinia would not forget this betrayal. She was not a woman who forgave, and she was certainly not a woman who forgave twice. Her pride had been wounded, and wounded pride in a woman like Lavinia was more dangerous than any weapon forged of steel. In the days that followed, Edmund became my constant companion and my guide through a world I had only ever observed from the margins. He helped me navigate the labyrinth of legal documents that came with my new position. explaining contracts and leases and investment portfolios in terms I could understand. The estate was vast and complicated, with holdings in 3 counties, investments in shipping and mining concerns, and obligations to hundreds of tenants whose livelihoods depended on decisions I would now have to make. There were account books that stretched back decades, correspondence with solicitors in London and Edinburgh, and even as far as the Americas, records of debts owed and debts paid, and arrangements so complex they seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. It was overwhelming, terrifying, a world I had never been permitted to glimpse during my years of service, when my concerns had extended no further than which rooms needed cleaning and which fires needed tending. But Edmund was patient, endlessly patient, guiding me through each document with the same care he might have shown a student of the law, never once making me feel foolish for my ignorance or my questions. He explained the difference between freehold and leasehold, between annuities and dividends, between trusts and direct bequests. He taught me how to read a balance sheet, how to evaluate an investment, how to spot the signs of a dishonest tradesman or an unscrupulous solicitor. And slowly, gradually, I began to understand the empire that had been placed in my hands, to see not just its complexity, but its potential for good. He introduced me to his colleagues in the legal profession, men who might have looked down upon a former maid, but who treated me with respect because Edmund insisted upon it. He brought me to dinners at their homes, to gatherings where I was the object of curiosity, but never, in his presence, the object of scorn. He defended me when the conversation turned to gossip about the Ashworth scandal, and he praised my intelligence and character to anyone who would listen. He became my advocate, my teacher, my protector, and something more, something neither of us had yet dared to name aloud. I found myself watching for his carriage each morning, listening for his footsteps in the corridor, feeling my heart quicken whenever he entered a room. These were feelings I had never known before, feelings I had never dared to imagine for someone like myself. In my years of service, I had watched romances bloom among the younger servants, had witnessed the stolen glances and whispered promises that passed between housemaids and footmen. But I had never thought such things were meant for me. I was the quiet one, the invisible one, the girl who scrubbed floors and carried coal and never expected anything more from life than the privilege of continuing to do so until her body gave out. The servants began to talk, of course. They always do. Gossip is the currency of great houses, passed from hand to hand more freely than gold, accumulating interest with each retelling until a simple fact becomes an elaborate tale. I heard the whispers when I passed through the kitchen, saw the knowing glances exchanged between housemaids and footmen when Edmund's carriage appeared on the drive. The new mistress and her gentleman, they called us, though we had done nothing improper. We walked together in the gardens despite the winter cold, our breath forming clouds in the frosty air as we discussed everything from the management of the estate to the poetry of Byron and Shelley. We dined together in the evenings, seated at opposite ends of the long table that had once separated the Duke from his Duchess, the candles burning low as our conversations stretched into the night. We spent hours in the library discussing books and philosophy and the state of the world, discovering in each other a hunger for knowledge and understanding that neither of us had expected to find. But Edmund never touched me beyond the occasional brush of hands, never spoke words that could not have been overheard by anyone. He was protecting my reputation, I knew, guarding the fragile respectability I had only just begun to build upon the foundation of the Duke's unexpected bequest. But Lavinia saw something else entirely. She saw what she wanted to see, what she needed to see to justify the hatred that consumed her every waking moment. She emerged from her self-imposed exile in the East Wing like a spider emerging from its web, sensing that prey had wandered too close. I encountered her one morning in the entrance hall, where I had been reviewing plans for repairs to the tenant cottages with Mr. Thornton. The winter had been harsh that year, one of the coldest in memory, and several families were suffering from roofs that leaked and walls that let in the biting wind. I wanted to help them, wanted to use some of the fortune I had inherited to ease their suffering, to prove that I was worthy of the trust the Duke had placed in me. Lavinia swept down the grand staircase in a gown of deep mourning, her face pale and composed beneath an elaborate arrangement of black lace. Every inch of her proclaimed grief, from the jet beads at her throat to the handkerchief clutched in her gloved hand. But her eyes told a different story. They burned with a hatred so intense it seemed to scorch the very air between us. "I see you have wasted no time in replacing my husband," she said, her voice carrying across the marble floor. "First you steal his fortune, and now you parade your lover through his house as though you were the lady of the manor rather than the scullery maid who scrubbed its floors." "Mr. Blackwood is not my lover," I said firmly. "He is a friend who has been kind enough to assist me with legal matters." Lavinia laughed, a sound like breaking ice. "Do you think anyone believes that? You are a servant, Florence. You will always be a servant, no matter how many fortunes you steal or how many barristers you seduce. And when the world sees you for what you truly are, you will have nothing left." She swept past me and out the front door, where a carriage was waiting. I learned later that she had gone to London, to the drawing rooms and ballrooms where society gathered to gossip and judge. I did not know then what poison she was spreading, what web she was weaving around my reputation with the skill of a master craftsman. I only knew that her departure brought a temporary peace to Ashworth Hall. But peace, I was learning, was a luxury that did not last. The first sign of trouble came a fortnight later, in the form of a letter from Lord Pemberton, a distant cousin of the Duke, who held considerable influence in Parliament. His letter was addressed to Miss Florence Webb, a title he underlined twice, and its contents were as cold as the December wind. "It has come to my attention," he wrote, "that you have been entertaining a gentleman at Ashworth Hall in a manner inconsistent with proper mourning and common decency. While the late Duke's will may have granted you ownership of the estate, it did not grant you license to disgrace his memory with unseemly conduct. I urge you to consider the damage you are doing to the Ashworth name." Lavinia had been busy indeed. She had taken her grievances to the highest levels of society, painting me as a wanton woman who had not only stolen her husband's fortune, but was now desecrating his memory. The fact that none of it was true mattered little. In the world of the aristocracy, perception was everything. More letters followed. Some were from relatives lecturing me on propriety. Others were from tradesmen who suddenly found reasons to delay deliveries or increase prices. One was from the vicar of the village church, suggesting that my presence at Sunday services was causing discomfort among the congregation, and perhaps I might consider worshipping elsewhere. I showed the letters to Edmund, who read them with a darkening expression. "She is trying to isolate you," he said. "If she cannot take your fortune through the courts, she will take it through the court of public opinion. She will make you so unwelcome that you will have no choice but to give up everything you have gained." "What can I do?" I asked, hating the tremor in my voice. "How can I fight an enemy I cannot see?" Edmund was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire that crackled in the library grate. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, and I watched him with a longing I had never known before. Then he turned to me, and there was something fierce in his eyes, something that made my heart quicken despite my fear. "You could marry me," he said. The words hung in the air between us, impossible and wonderful and terrifying all at once. I stared at him, unable to speak, unable to think. "I know it is sudden," he continued, his voice softer now. "I know we have known each other only a few weeks, but I have felt more in those weeks than I have felt in my entire life. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, Florence. Your strength, your dignity, your quiet courage in the face of everything that has been thrown at you. I would be honored beyond measure to call you my wife." "Edmund," I whispered, "you cannot mean it. You are a respected barrister. Your reputation would be ruined if you married a former servant, a woman already tainted by scandal. Everything you have worked for would be destroyed." He crossed the room and took my hands in his grip warm and steady. "Do you think I care about reputation?" he asked fiercely. "Do you think I care what society whispers behind its fans? I have built my career on truth and justice, Florence. And the truth is that you deserve better than what this world has given you. The truth is that I love you." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. "I love you too," I said, the words emerging before I could stop them. "I have loved you since that first day in the drawing room. But I am afraid, Edmund. I'm afraid of what Lavinia will do when she learns of this. I'm afraid of what it will cost you." "Let her do her worst," he said, and there was steel in his voice now. "We will face it together. Whatever comes, we will face it together." We were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at a chapel in London, where the vicar cared more about the sincerity of the couple before him than their social standing. Edmund's colleagues served as witnesses, along with Mrs. Hartley, who wept throughout the entire service and embraced me afterward as though I were her own daughter. It was not the grand wedding that society would have expected for the mistress of Ashworth Hall, but it was everything I had ever dreamed of. It was simple and honest and true. The announcement appeared in the newspapers the following day. Mr. Edmund Blackwood, barrister at law, to Miss Florence Webb of Ashworth Hall, Hertfordshire. Lavinia would have seen it over her morning chocolate. I imagined her face when she read those words, the fury that must have contorted her features. We returned to Ashworth Hall as husband and wife, intending to begin our new life in the house that was now truly ours. But when our carriage pulled up to the front entrance, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The servants who should have been waiting to greet us were nowhere to be seen. The front door stood ajar, swinging slightly in the winter wind. And from somewhere deep within the house, I could hear the sound of voices raised in anger. Edmund helped me down from the carriage, his hand tight on mine. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. We entered the hall together, and what I saw stopped me in my tracks. Lavinia stood at the center of the grand staircase, dressed in a traveling gown of dark green velvet, a trunk open at her feet. Around her, servants scurried back and forth, carrying silver and paintings and objects I recognized as belonging to the Ashworth collection. She was not merely leaving, she was stripping the house of everything she could carry. "What is the meaning of this?" Edmund demanded, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Lavinia looked down at us, and there was triumph in her smile, cold and glittering as ice. "Ah, the happy couple returns. You are just in time to watch me take what is rightfully mine." "Nothing in this house is yours," I said, finding my voice. The will was clear. "Everything belongs to me." "The will!" she spat. "I may not be able to challenge it in court, but there are other courts that matter more, the court of society, and those courts have already rendered their verdict on you." She descended the stairs slowly. "Did you think marriage would save you? You are still what you have always been. A thief? A seductress? Leave this house immediately," Edmund said, stepping forward, "and take nothing that does not belong to you. If you refuse, I will have you arrested for theft." Lavinia laughed. "Arrest me? The scandal would be delicious. Do you really think that would help your precious reputation?" I stepped forward, my voice steady. "Take whatever you want. Take the silver and the paintings and the jewelry. But when you have finished, you will never set foot in this house again. And you will spend the rest of your life knowing that the lazy maid you despised is living in your house, sleeping in your bed, bearing the title you thought was yours by right." Lavinia's face went white. "You have not heard the last of me," she said quietly. "I will destroy you yet, Florence. Mark my words." She departed that evening, her carriages loaded with treasures she had no right to claim. I let her go without protest. The silver could be replaced. What mattered was that she was gone. But as I watched her carriages disappear into the winter darkness, I knew that this was not the end. Lavinia had made a promise, and she was not a woman who forgot her promises. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. and I would need every ounce of strength I possessed to survive what was coming. The winter passed slowly, each day bringing new challenges and new whispers from the world beyond Ashworth Hall. Lavinia had not been idle in her exile. From her rented house in Mayfair, she continued her campaign of destruction, hosting dinner parties where my name was spoken with contempt, writing letters to newspapers hinting at scandals she could not quite prove, poisoning every well she could reach with her particular brand of elegant venom. But something unexpected began to happen, something that neither Lavinia nor I had anticipated. The tenants of the Ashworth estate began to speak. It started with small things. A farmer's wife mentioned to a shopkeeper in the village that the new mistress had sent blankets and coal to every cottage on the estate when the cold snap struck. A groundskeeper told his brother, who told his employer, who told his wife, that Miss Florence had personally visited the families whose roofs had been damaged by the storms, and that repairs had begun within days rather than the months or years they had learned to expect under the old management. A young woman who had been in service at the hall before my elevation spoke to a journalist, not for money, but because she felt it was right, and told him that Florence Webb had been the hardest worker she had ever known, that she had risen before dawn and retired after midnight, that she had been kind to the youngest maids and patient with the oldest footmen. The stories spread, as stories do, from village to village, from county to county, until they reached London itself. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the tide began to turn. I did not know any of this was happening. I was too consumed with the work of managing the estate, of learning my new responsibilities, of building a life with Edmund in the house that had once been my prison. We converted the Duchess's former chambers into a joint study where we worked side by side, he on his legal briefs and I on the endless correspondence that came with owning half a county. We took our meals together in the small breakfast room rather than the cavernous dining hall, and we spent our evenings in the library, reading aloud to each other or simply sitting in companionable silence while the fire crackled and the winter wind howled outside. It was a quiet life, far removed from the glittering society that Lavinia had once commanded. But it was a good life, an honest life, and I was happier than I had ever imagined possible. Spring came early that year, as if the earth itself was eager to leave the darkness behind. The gardens burst into bloom, daffodils and crocuses pushing through the last patches of snow, and the tenants began their planting with an energy that seemed almost celebratory. I walked the grounds every morning, learning the names of the families who worked the land, understanding for the first time the weight of responsibility that came with my position. These people depended on decisions I would make. Their children would grow up in houses I maintained, eat food from fields I managed, live or starve based on my wisdom or my folly. It was terrifying. It was also, I discovered, deeply meaningful. Mr. Thornton became my most trusted advisor in matters of the estate. He had served the Duke faithfully for 2 decades, and he transferred that loyalty to me without hesitation, guiding me through the complexities of agricultural management, tenant relations, and the 1,000 small decisions that determined whether an estate prospered or declined. Under his tutelage, I learned to read the land as I had once read the moods of my employers, to anticipate problems before they arose, to balance the needs of the present against the demands of the future. Mrs. Hartley, meanwhile, took charge of transforming me into something resembling a proper lady of the manor. She hired a dressmaker from London to create a wardrobe suitable for my new station, gently but firmly steering me away from the drab colors and simple cuts I had worn all my life toward silks and velvets in shades of deep blue and forest green that she said brought out my eyes. She taught me which fork to use at formal dinners, how to address a marquis versus an earl, the proper way to pour tea for guests of varying ranks. I was an eager student, not because I cared about such things for their own sake, but because I understood that mastering them was necessary for the battles that still lay ahead. For Lavinia had not given up. She could not give up. Her hatred was too deep, her humiliation too complete, for her to simply accept defeat and fade into obscurity. The attack came in late April, on a day when the apple trees were heavy with blossoms and the air smelled of new beginnings. Edmund was in London on business when a carriage arrived at the front entrance, bearing the crest of the Lord Chancellor himself. I received the visitor in the drawing room, my heart pounding with apprehension, for such visits rarely brought good news. The man who entered was small and precise, with spectacles perched on a nose that seemed designed for looking down at those he addressed. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, and his use of my married name was somehow more insulting than if he had called me a servant to my face, "I am here on a matter of some delicacy. Certain allegations have been made regarding the circumstances of your inheritance. Allegations of fraud, of forgery, of undue influence over a man in his final illness. His lordship has deemed it necessary to conduct a formal inquiry." The blood drained from my face. I had known Lavinia would not rest, but I had not expected this. A formal inquiry meant public scrutiny, official investigation, the possibility that everything I had built could be torn away based on nothing more than the word of a woman scorned. "I have nothing to hide," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. The Duke's will was legally sound. His solicitor confirmed it. His physician attested to his mental competence. The man smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. "That may be so, but allegations have been made and they must be investigated. You will be required to present yourself before a panel of inquiry in 3 weeks' time. I suggest you prepare your defense carefully, Mrs. Blackwood. The consequences of an unfavorable finding would be severe." He departed, leaving me alone with my fear. I sent an urgent message to Edmund, who returned that same evening, his face dark with anger when he learned what had transpired. "This is Lavinia's doing," he said, pacing the library like a caged lion. "She has friends in high places, connections she cultivated during her years as Duchess. She cannot win in a fair fight, so she has arranged for an unfair one." "What can we do?" I asked. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not seen before. It was not fear, though fear would have been understandable. It was determination, fierce and absolute. "We fight," he said. "We gather every piece of evidence that proves the Duke's intentions were genuine and his mind was sound. We find every witness who can attest to your character and your conduct. And we expose Lavinia for the vindictive, grasping woman she truly is." The 3 weeks that followed were the most intense of my life. Edmund worked day and night, calling in favors from colleagues, interviewing servants and solicitors and physicians, building a case so thorough that no honest inquiry could fail to see the truth. I did my part as well, writing to everyone who had known me during my years of service, asking them to speak on my behalf. Some refused, too frightened of Lavinia's reach to risk her displeasure. But others agreed, and their letters of support began to arrive, a steady stream of testimony to a life lived with dignity and honor. And then something remarkable happened. The tenants came forward. It began with a single letter, written in a rough hand on cheap paper, from a farmer named Thomas Wilkins, whose family had worked Ashworth land for 3 generations. He wrote of the new mistress who had visited his cottage after his wife fell ill, who had sent a doctor from London at her own expense, who had forgiven 3 months of rent so that he could focus on caring for his family rather than worrying about losing his home. He wrote that he did not know much about the law or the ways of the aristocracy, but he knew a good woman when he saw one, and Florence Blackwood was the best woman he had ever had the privilege to serve. Other letters followed, dozens of them, then hundreds, farmers and shepherds, blacksmiths and millers, all writing to testify to the character of the woman who had inherited their landlord's estate. They wrote of her kindness, her fairness, her genuine concern for their welfare. They wrote of improvements she had made, repairs she had ordered, policies she had changed to ease their burdens. They wrote, in simple words that carried more weight than any legal argument, of a woman who had risen from their own ranks and had not forgotten where she came from. Edmund gathered the letters and brought them to the inquiry. The panel, composed of 3 lords who had expected a simple case of a scheming servant finally brought to justice, found themselves confronted with evidence they had not anticipated. They heard testimony from the Duke's physician, who stated unequivocally that His Grace had been of sound mind and clear purpose when he signed his will. They heard from his solicitor, who described the care and deliberation with which the Duke had crafted his final wishes. They heard from Mrs. Hartley and Mr. Thornton and a parade of servants who spoke of my years of faithful service. And they heard from the tenants, 3 of whom had traveled to London at their own expense to speak in person. Thomas Wilkins stood before the panel in his Sunday best, his weathered hands clasped before him, and told them what Florence Webb meant to the people of Ashworth. His voice shook with emotion, but his words were clear. "She is one of us," he said. "She knows what it is to work until your bones ache, to worry about whether you can feed your family, to hope for nothing more than a fair chance and a kind word. And now that she has the power to help, she has not forgotten. She has not become like the others, looking down on us from her great house. She has remained true, and I would stake my life on her honor." The panel deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the lead lord, a stern man whose face had remained impassive throughout the proceedings, looked directly at me and spoke. "The allegations against Mrs. Florence Blackwood have been examined and found to be without merit. The will of the late Duke of Ashworth stands as written. Furthermore, this panel notes with displeasure the frivolous and malicious nature of the claims that prompted this inquiry, and recommends that the individual responsible be censured for wasting the time and resources of this body." I heard the words, but they did not seem real. Edmund's hand found mine and squeezed, and I looked up at him through eyes blurred with tears. It was over. We had won. The aftermath of the inquiry was swift and decisive. Lavinia, exposed as the source of the false allegations, found herself suddenly unwelcome in the very drawing rooms she had once dominated. The friends who had listened to her poison now turned away, embarrassed to have been associated with such a petty vendetta. The newspapers that had once printed her insinuations now printed retractions, and some went further, publishing stories about the lazy maid who had proven herself more noble than any duchess. I took no pleasure in her downfall. How could I? I knew what it was to be cast out, to be looked upon with contempt, to have nowhere to turn. But I also knew that Lavinia had brought this upon herself, that every stone she had thrown had ultimately fallen back upon her own head. She left England that summer, taking passage on a ship bound for the continent. I heard that she settled in Italy, in a villa near Florence, which seemed an irony too pointed to be accidental. I never saw her again. I never wanted to. The years that followed were kind to us. Edmund continued his legal practice, taking on cases that mattered to him, defending those who could not defend themselves. I continued to manage the estate, improving the lives of the tenants, restoring the house to a warmth it had never known under its previous masters. We entertained rarely, preferring the company of true friends to the endless social obligations that plagued others of our station. But when we did open our doors, they were opened to all, to colleagues and servants and tenants alike, for we had learned that worth was not determined by birth or title, but by the content of one's character. The Duke's letter remained in my bedside drawer, folded carefully, taken out, and read whenever I needed to remember where I had come from and why I had been given this extraordinary second chance at life. His words still moved me, even after all these years. "You are the farthest thing from lazy. What you are is invisible to those who do not wish to see." But I was invisible no longer. The world had seen me at last, not as the lazy maid or the scheming servant, but as the woman I had always been, a woman of dignity, a woman of worth, a woman who had endured cruelty without losing her kindness, who had risen from the lowest station to the highest without losing her soul. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house was still, I would walk through the corridors of Ashworth Hall and marvel at the strange turns of fate that had brought me here. I would pause at the library door and remember the night the Duke had spoken to me, the night he had seen me when no one else would. I would climb the grand staircase and recall the countless times I had scrubbed those steps on my hands and knees, never dreaming that one day I would descend them in silk and pearls. And I would find Edmund waiting for me in our chambers, the man who had chosen me when choosing me meant risking everything, who had loved me not despite my past, but because of it, who had stood beside me through storms that would have broken lesser bonds. "I love you," I would say, as I said every night. "And I love you," he would reply, as he replied every night, "more than all the fortunes in England." We would fall asleep in each other's arms, and I would dream not of the past, but of the future, of the good we could do together, of the lives we could touch and change. The Duke had left me his fortune, but he had given me something far more valuable. He had given me the chance to become myself, to prove that worth is not determined by station or circumstance, to show the world that even the humblest among us can rise to greatness if only someone believes in us enough to give us the opportunity. I had been invisible once. I had been called lazy, worthless, beneath notice, but I had never believed it. Not truly, not in the deepest part of my heart, and in the end, the truth had set me free.